I used to think that the worst thing in life was being invisible. But now I know the worst thing is being seen just enough to be forgotten. That's what I was to them. A blurred face in the hallway, a faint name on a roster, a quiet girl with no history loud enough to echo back. They never really looked at me. Not the teachers, not the classmates, not even the people who were supposed to care. I was just another placeholder. A name to round out the list. A shadow that passed through the frame of their lives, but never stayed long enough to register. And the cruelest part? I tried. I tried so hard to be someone they'd remember. I wore the right clothes, laughed at the right times, spoke only when I felt it was safe. But safety is an illusion when you're already marked as irrelevant. They had their golden ones, the ones with perfect skin, loud voices, and fathers who owned property in 3 states, the ones who were born with volume in their name. I was. Background noise. I remember the day of the senior trip. Everyone was buzzing. The bus was late, as always, and we stood outside in that sticky spring heat that made your clothes cling to you like guilt. They clustered in groups, snapping pictures, recording stories they thought would matter forever. I stood by the fence. No one asked where I'd been. No one asked if I'd eaten. No one asked anything, but I saw them. I saw the looks. The way Ava whispered something behind her hand, and Logan laughed without trying to hide it. The way the boys nudged each other. When I turned around, I wasn't part of their inside jokes. I was the punchline, and still, I smiled because I'd convinced myself that maybe, if I was kind enough, quiet enough, useful enough, they'd let me stay near the edge of their world. It didn't work. Nothing ever did. I was always on the outside of everything. Every invitation was sent with obligation, not intention. Every group project left me with the grunt work. Every social event had me carrying bags, not being in the pictures, and then came the accident, the moment everything changed. Or rather, the moment that showed me I was never supposed to make it back. We were on that trip, 2 buses. One full of the chosen, the popular, the golden, the loud. The other ours, the extras, the invisible, the leftovers. I sat near the window, 3rd row from the back, headphones in, eyes on the road. And then the road cracked open. Screams tore through the air, metal bent like paper. Time slowed. They said later it was a mechanical failure, a brake line. But I knew better. I remembered Ava's laugh before we got on the road. Logan's smirk, the sudden shift in seating assignments, the empty seats that should have been filled. The substitute driver, unfamiliar face, no name tag. They planned it. Maybe not to kill us, but to get rid of the ones who didn't matter. Who would ask questions if the quiet ones didn't come back? The bus went over the edge, into the ravine. Flipped, fire, smoke. I heard screams, then silence. Then me. I was the only one who crawled out. I should have died. They all did. But I didn't, and that ruined everything. Because suddenly, I wasn't invisible anymore. Suddenly, I mattered, but only because I disrupted the script. I was a survivor, but not a hero. I was a problem. They didn't rush to comfort me. They rushed to silence me. First came the counselors, then the NDA, then the cameras, but only long enough to paint the narrative. They called it a tragedy. They called me resilient. They called it unfortunate. But they never called what it really was, a message. I knew too much. I wasn't supposed to remember the details, the faces, the timing, the names of the ones who conveniently switched buses. But I did, and now I was a threat. They started watching me, tapping my phone, deleting my posts. Whispers followed me in every hallway I walked, and when I tried to speak, no one believed me, because who would believe the invisible girl who'd been forgotten so long she became a ghost? But here's the thing about ghosts. They see everything, and I had nothing left to lose. I kept walking through the hallways like I didn't exist. People brushed past me, some offering that half smile you give to strangers you vaguely recognize but don't want to talk to. My name was never whispered in excitement, only in pity or in annoyance. Her again. She's so weird, always alone. I knew what they said. You start to hear it even when now. One's talking. They don't have to call you a ghost to make you feel like one dot. It's funny how people assume being invisible is peaceful, that you're lucky not to be part of their chaos, their drama, their social politics. But being unseen doesn't mean you're safe. It means no one checks on you. No one knows when you're hurting. No one remembers you were even there. I used to think maybe I was born broken, like something inside me was missing, something people could smell on me from across the room. I'd watch the girls in my class throw their heads back in laughter, their eyes sparkling as if the world wanted them, chose them, and I wondered what it would be like to be chosen. Just once, lunch was the worst. I stopped bringing food because I hated pretending to eat alone. I would walk the halls slowly, aimlessly, tracing the cracks in the floor with my eyes, timing my steps so it didn't look like I was wandering. That's the trick to being unnoticed. Act like you have a purpose. Even if you don't. There was this moment once, a stupid small thing. A pencil rolled off someone's desk during class and I bent down to grab it. When I handed it back, the girl looked me in the eye and said, "Thanks." Just that, just ... thanks ... my heart flipped. Not because I thought she'd be my friend, or that anything would change, but because, for a second, I was real. I existed in someone else's world. I held on to that moment like a photograph. Over and over again, but even the smallest kindnesses stopped coming. The only person who seemed to notice me regularly was Mr. Devon, our English teacher. He'd ask how I was doing when I stayed after class. I'd just nod and mumble, but he'd smile anyway. Once he told me I had a poetic way of writing. I think I cried that night, not because he said it, but because it had been so long since anyone said anything nice about me. I started writing more after that. In notebooks, on napkins, in the margins of my textbooks. Stories about girls who didn't belong, but found secret doors, hidden dimensions, whole worlds where they mattered. It didn't make reality easier, but it gave me something to breathe through. Something that didn't judge the way I walked or talked or stayed quiet too long. At home, it wasn't much better. My mom was tired all the time. She worked 2 jobs, and even when she was there, she wasn't really there. My stepfather mostly ignored me unless he was annoyed. Then he'd say things like, "Why are you so dramatic?" Or, "You think you're better than everyone?" I never knew how to answer. I didn't feel like anything. There were nights I stared at the ceiling in my room, wondering if I'd always feel like a placeholder in my own life. Just someone standing in for a real person, waiting for the script to change, but no one rewrites. Your life for you. That's the lie they sell you in movies. There was a mirror on the back of my bedroom door. I started avoiding it, not because I hated my face, though I didn't love it, but because the more I looked, the less I recognized myself. I didn't see a person anymore, just ... pieces, hair, eyes, skin, clothes. Disconnected. Nothing holding it all together. I didn't even cry that much. Loneliness doesn't always look like sadness. Sometimes it's just quiet. A silence so thick it swallows the hours. I remember one afternoon walking past a classroom where they were rehearsing for the school play. The laughter inside was wild, alive, full of stories I'd never be a part of. I stood outside the door for a second, imagining myself in there, saying lines. Being seen. Then someone closed the door in my face. Did they know I was there? Probably not. Or maybe they did. Maybe they just didn't care. That was the part that hurt the most, not the cruelty. Indifference. No one hated me enough to bully me. They just didn't think I was worth the effort. I stopped speaking in class. I stopped raising my hand. I stopped hoping. Until the day I couldn't anymore. I was walking past the gym after school when I heard someone crying. A girl, beautiful, popular, flawless, crouched beside the vending machine, mascara running down her cheeks. For a moment, I hesitated. This wasn't my world. Her pain wasn't my business. But then, I remembered what it was like to cry alone and have no one care. I walked over. I didn't say anything. Just sat on the floor next to her. She didn't look at me, but she didn't tell me to leave either. We stayed there for 10 minutes, silent, breathing. Eventually, she stood up and wiped her face. Thanks, she whispered, and just like that. I existed again. It was small, but it was something. And for the first time in months, I walked home with my head a little higher, not because I was seen, but because I had seen someone else. I remember the first time I stopped looking at myself in the mirror. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No tears, no self-loathing monologue. It was just a quiet surrender. I walked past the hallway mirror one morning and realized I hadn't glanced at my reflection in days. I wasn't avoiding it. I simply didn't care anymore. There was no one left in there worth seeing. Something happens when you're treated as a background character in your own life for long enough. You start believing that maybe that's all you're meant to be, that your voice isn't necessary, that your story isn't worth telling, that your presence is just a placeholder for someone else's spotlight. I became efficient at disappearing, at being agreeable, at not taking up space. In school, I learned to laugh just enough so they wouldn't call me weird, but never loud enough to draw attention. I answered questions only when directly asked. I wore neutral clothes, sat in the back, lowered my eyes when teachers asked for volunteers. At home, I did chores without being reminded, and I did them quietly. I tiptoed around conflict, swallowed opinions, and kept my tone soft. My mother once told me I was her easiest child, not realizing that my silence was not peace, but resignation. The older I got, the more invisible I became, and at some point, I began to believe I deserved it. When you're not chosen over and over again, for friendships, for projects, for parties, for love, it chips away at you, not all at once, not in ways anyone would notice, but piece by piece, until there's nothing left but outlines. Sometimes I wonder if there's a version of me that would have existed, a loud version, a bold one, if someone had just seen me differently early on. If one teacher had said, "You're special." If one friend had insisted, "Come sit with us." If one adult had looked me in the eyes and said, "I believe in you." But they did IDN single quotes T. So instead, I lived life like I was apologizing for being here. Until the breaking point came. Not in the way you'd think. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was a whisper in my own mind, so quiet I almost missed it. It happened at the grocery store. I was picking up milk. That's it. Just milk. And someone bumped into me with their cart, hard enough to hurt. They didn't say sorry. It didn't even look at me. Just kept going, and I stood there, stunned. Not because of the pain, but because I wasn't surprised. It felt expected, like, of course I'm the one who gets hit and ignored. Of course I'm the one who doesn't get acknowledged. And in that moment I thought, is this it? Is this all I'm meant for? To be the person who absorbs the world's carelessness? That night, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror for the first time in weeks. I looked at myself and I hated what I saw, not because of how I looked, but because of how much I had vanished. My eyes looked like strangers. My posture screamed defeat. My skin, my hair, my voice, all dulled. Like I'd been living life in grayscale while the world kept moving in color. I whispered out loud, "Where did I go?" No one answered, but something stirred inside me that night. Something small, something wild. A tiny, reckless thought, what if I came back? Not for them, not to be chosen or praised or finally seen, but for me. For the girl who used to laugh until her stomach hurt. For the one who used to sing in her room, dance with no rhythm, scribble poetry in the margins of her notebooks. For the one who once dreamed of writing stories, of becoming something, someone. I didn't want to be invisible anymore, but I also didn't want revenge. Didn't want to prove anything to the people who had passed me over. I just wanted to remember what it felt like to exist fully, so I began very slowly. I didn't cut my hair or quit my job or post some dramatic announcement. I just started noticing myself again. I chose clothes I liked. Even if they stood out, I started humming again while I walked. I wrote 1 page a night in a cheap notebook. Not a masterpiece, just thoughts, feelings, rage, hope. I said no to things that drained me, even if people didn't understand. Took photos of things I found beautiful. I put sticky notes on my mirror with phrases like, "You matter, even if no one says it." And you know what? Nothing magical happened, no grand applause. No sudden friends or admirers, but I started to breathe differently. I started to feel again, it was terrifying and exhilarating. One night, months later, I was walking home and caught my reflection in a shop window. I didn't look powerful or glamorous or important, but I looked real, present, and for the first time in years, I smiled, not to please someone else, not to hide discomfort, but because I recognized the girl staring back. She was coming back to life, and I promised her I wouldn't lose her again. I remember the day I stopped waiting for an apology that would never come. It wasn't a grand event. There was no dramatic closure, no final conversation where everything suddenly made sense. Just a quiet realization at the back of my throat. As I stirred sugar into my coffee in a place I didn't recognize yet called home, looked up and saw my own reflection in the window blurred by the morning fog, and I realized I didn't hate her anymore. For a long time, I had blamed her, my reflection, for not being stronger, for crying too easily, for staying too long in rooms where love was only spoken in past tense. I hated her for smiling through disappointment, for believing in words that were meant only to pacify, never to build. I hated how easily she forgave and how hard she begged to be chosen, but in that moment, I felt something shift. Not a wave, not a storm, just a soft inner silence. The kind of silence that comes not from emptiness, but from clarity. It was the first time I saw myself without judgment, and that changed everything. I had spent years trying to become small enough to be loved, shrinking my voice, dulling my colors, hiding the brightest parts of me because they made others squint. I tried to be agreeable, understandable, convenient, but no one ever loved me more because I made myself less. They loved the convenience, the obedience, the predictability. They never loved me, and for a long time, I took that as proof that I was unworthy of love. That if I could just fix one more thing, my body, my tone, my expectations, maybe then I'd finally be enough for someone to stay. But the truth is, I wasn't too much. They were simply unwilling to hold what was real. I think the most painful part of heartbreak isn't the goodbye. It's the realization that you were never really seen. That someone held your hand and never actually looked at your soul. That the version of you they loved existed only in the confines of their comfort. That's the part that breaks you, and that's the part I had to rebuild. Piece by piece, I began reclaiming myself. It started with small rebellions. Saying no, without explanation. Wearing colors that made me feel bold. even if they drew attention. Laughing loudly in public again, sitting alone in restaurants, refusing to feel ashamed for enjoying my own company. I started answering questions with honesty instead of strategy. I stopped explaining my silence. I stopped apologizing for needing space. And slowly, like light returning. After a long eclipse, I began to feel whole, not perfect, not healed in every way, but whole in the sense that I no longer felt fragmented, scattered across the opinions of others, broken into pieces by every failed connection. The world didn't applaud. There were no cheers, no recognition. In fact, I lost people, friends, who only knew how to love the version of me that agreed with everything. Family members who called this growth selfish or cold. I was told I'd become hard, too independent, too distant, but they never asked if I was finally at peace, and I was. Because when you find your own wholeness, it doesn't look like power. It looks like quiet, like choosing peace over performance, like resting instead of proving, like existing without begging to be seen. There was one moment, a few weeks after I stopped chasing closure, when someone from my past reached out. Just a short message, one of those, "Hey, I've been thinking about you" kind of texts. The old me would have spiraled, wondered what it meant, how to respond, what it might lead to. But this version of me, she didn't flinch. I read the message and felt nothing but gratitude for the reminder how far I'd come, because that girl who once cried over the silence, she no longer needed a reply. I closed the message, set my phone down, and returned to the novel I'd been reading. My tea had gone cold, but my heart was warm, steady, quiet. That's how I knew I was no longer waiting for someone else to complete me. I had come home to myself. And in that home, every version of me, the broken, the brave, the bitter, the soft, they all had a place at the table. No more shame, no more exile. No more trying to be lovable by being less. This was my wholeness, and no one could take it from me again. The most unexpected thing about healing was that it didn't come as a sudden explosion of change. There was no grand moment where I stood on a rooftop and declared my independence or walked away from everything with a dramatic flourish. Healing came in the quiet moments, the ones that no one ever sees or applauds. I started to realize that recovery was less about forgetting the past and more about learning how to live with it. It was about allowing myself to feel the cracks without falling apart, to carry the scars like badges of survival rather than stains of shame. Every day was a small battle, fought not with swords or words, but with simple acts of kindness toward myself. Some mornings I woke up and hated my reflection all over again. I would stare into the mirror, searching for the woman I was becoming, and find only fragments of doubt and pain. But instead of turning away, I began to sit with those feelings, like a guest I didn't know how to entertain. I learned that acknowledging my fears didn't make me weak, it made me human. Slowly, I rebuilt routines that nourished me instead of drained me. I cooked meals that warmed more than my stomach. I read books that sparked hope rather than despair. I began to explore art and music that spoke to my soul's hidden corners. These were not grand gestures. They were small acts of rebellion against the apathy that once swallowed me whole. One of the hardest lessons was learning to set boundaries. I had spent years bending, folding, and erasing parts of myself to fit into the shapes others made for me. Saying no felt like a radical act. It felt like pushing back against a tide that had always pulled me under. But each time I said no, I found a little more strength, a little more space to breathe. There were people who didn't like this new version of me. Friends who felt abandoned because I no longer fit the role they'd assigned me. Family who labeled me as difficult or selfish. But with each criticism, I reminded myself that I was no longer living to please others. I was living to honor myself. The process wasn't linear. There were days when the old wounds bled fresh again, when loneliness crept in like a cold shadow, and the temptation to slip back into invisibility was strong. But I held on to the smallest sparks, a kind word from a stranger, a page of writing that felt true. A morning when the sun broke through the clouds just right, and with each passing day, the pieces of me grew stronger. Not because the pain vanished, but because I chose to carry it differently. I chose to carry it with courage. I remember the moment I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living. Truly living. It wasn't loud or flashy. It was a quiet morning walk in the park, the kind of day where the air smells like earth and hope. I felt the sun on my face, the breeze on my skin, and I thought, I'm still here. I'm still me. That's when I knew I had found my way back, not to who I was before the heartbreaks, but to who I was meant to be after them. The final pieces of my story aren't the ones you might expect. There was no triumphant moment where I stood tall and shouted my victory. No applause, no headlines, no grand gestures to mark the end of the pain. Instead, it was a quiet revolution, one that unfolded slowly within the chambers of my own heart. After years of losing myself in the faces of those who never truly saw me, I finally stopped searching for validation outside. The moment I ceased to beg for someone else's approval, I found a deep and steady strength within. I learned that healing isn't about forgetting the wounds or pretending the pain never existed. It's about embracing the scars, the fractures, and the shadows they cast, and choosing to keep moving forward anyway. I started to reclaim my narrative, rewriting the story I had told myself for so long, the one that whispered I was broken, unworthy, and unlovable. That story no longer held power over me. There were moments of doubt, yes. Nights when the silence felt like an echo chamber of old fears. Days when the weight of loneliness pressed hard against my ribs. But through it all, I discovered the quiet resilience that lives in simply showing up for myself every single day. Love I once sought in others began to bloom within me. I nurtured it with patience and compassion, watered it with forgiveness and acceptance. No longer did I measure my worth by the approval of others or the fleeting promises of love that came and went like seasons. Instead, I found peace in my own company, joy in small victories, and strength in my authentic self. Looking back, I realized that every heartbreak, every rejection, every silent tear shed in the dark was a step on this journey, not to losing myself, but to finding my whole. Today, I stand here not as a woman defined by her past, but as one empowered by it. Whole. Unbroken. Free. And in this newfound wholeness, I discovered a truth that no one else could give me. I am enough just as I am. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Subscribe for more real stories that reveal the quiet strength behind every fall and the beauty of rising again.